Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in support of Bill C-201, 201, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, travel and accommodation deduction for tradespersons. And I want to thank the honourable member for Hamilton Mountain for tabling this bill in the House of Commons. I want to thank the honourable member for Hamilton Mountain on behalf of untold thousands, tens of thousands of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and Atlantic Canadians, Canadians in general, who migrate for work across this country and around the world. I meet them at airports, I talk to them on airplanes, I knock on the doors of their families left behind. Mr. Speaker, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have a history of working away from home. Our forefathers worked on the Grand Banks and off the Labrador for months on end. Our forefathers lived on wooden walls, their sealing ships, Mr. Speaker, for weeks when they were in the fat, when the seal hunt was in its prime. In my riding of St. John's South Mount Pearl, on the top of Signal Hill at the entrance to St. John's Harbour is a peak that's known as Ladies' Lookout. Ladies' Lookout is the very point where women gathered for generations to look for their men returning from sea after days, weeks, after months, and after years. The wharf and lookout of yesterday, Mr. Speaker, is the airport of today. So many Newfoundland and Labrador families live on a rotation, 2 weeks on, 1 week off, 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Long commutes and extended absences have been a way of life in Newfoundland and Labrador. However, Mr. Speaker, the scale and intensity of the westward move to places like Fort Mac, Fort McMurray, Grand Prairie, and Lloydminster that began a few decades ago sets it apart from past experience. Let me quote from a recent article I read on the Newfoundland and Labrador migration. Quote, "Some call it a rite of passage. Some wives back home call it a fiscal blessing, but a blow to the heart. It's not just men that migrate for work, Mr. Speaker. It's women, too. It's our youth. It's our newly educated. It's baymen and townie alike. Leaving for work is a way of life, especially since the early 1990s when our fisheries collapsed. We've lost 90,000 people since then, Mr. Speaker. 90,000 people, one-sixth of our population left, gone. And untold thousands of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians migrate for work on a weekly or monthly basis so that their families can live comfortably back home. It's how I grew up personally, Mr. Speaker, with my father. My father gone away for 6 to 9 months at a time. He worked on what was then known as the distant early warning line across the north. Mr. Speaker, if you drive through the outports today in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, you'll see nice homes, new homes, nice vehicles, pride in property, but you've always seen that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my office has tried to research the amount of money that migrant Newfoundland and Labrador workers bring home, bring back with them. There are no accurate numbers, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you this, it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, it's in the billions of dollars, Mr. Speaker. According to Stats Canada, the number of workers commuting from Atlantic Canada to Alberta increased threefold between 2004 and 2008. The median earnings from oil and gas workers in Alberta who live out of province was just under $60,000 in 2009. Mr. Speaker, this bill will impact thousands of Atlantic Canadians and Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. This bill will allow tradespersons and apprentices to deduct travel and accommodation expenses from their taxable income. This bill will allow tradespeople to maintain employment on work sites that are more than 80 kilometers away. This bill will help migratory workers. This bill will help migratory construction workers. There is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that this bill will help workers in my riding of St. John's South Mount Pearl in all of Newfoundland and Labrador and Atlantic Canada. Workers have to leave home. That's hard enough, but Mr. Speaker, they shouldn't have to foot the bill for travel and accommodation too. Under current rules, construction workers often incur large personal expenses to accept jobs in other parts of the country, other parts of the province or country, because neither travel nor accommodation expenses are taxes deductible under the Income Tax Act. These costs create a huge disincentive for workers to accept work in other parts of the country that are experiencing skill shortages. Now, figures suggest that the average mobile worker spends approximately $3,500 of his or her own money to temporarily relocate. $3,500, Mr. Speaker. Now, that $3,500 is a significant barrier to the appeal of accepting jobs away from home. We have to make it easier, Mr. Speaker, more enticing for skilled laborers in this country to fill labor shortages in other parts of the country. Now, how much will this bill cost, Mr. Speaker? It's actually revenue neutral for the federal government because the cost associated with the income tax cut is more than made up by the savings in employment insurance. Now, instead of punishing Canadians who receive EI, we can start helping skilled laborers in this country by making it easier for them to accept work. Now, let me throw out some numbers, Mr. Speaker. There are an estimated 1.6 million construction workers in Canada. 1.6 million. 10% of them travel each year. And at an average cost of $3,500 per worker, a 15% tax credit will cost the federal government $525 per mobile worker per year. Now, that's for a total cost of $84 million. But working with the same number of 160,000 traveling skilled trades workers, that's 10% of 1.6 million, whose average weekly employment insurance benefits would be $393 per week for an average period of unemployment of 4 weeks, means that the government would pay $250 million in EI benefits per year. That works out to $84 million in a tax cut versus $250 million in EI benefits, Mr. Speaker. That means that the tax credit proposed in this bill would result in a net savings of $160 million a year, more than $160 million a year, Mr. Speaker. But this bill doesn't just help workers, Mr. Speaker. This bill would help employers because they will have larger pools of skilled workers across this country to draw from, and they won't have to resort to hiring temporary foreign workers to get the jobs done. This bill will also help Newfoundland and Labrador. We have huge projects on the horizon, Mr. Speaker. Lake Labrador's Muskrat Falls, like offshore oil projects. We've had 3 new offshore oil discoveries within the past year off Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. Now, despite successive Conservative and Liberal governments making promises for years about helping migratory workers, there's been nothing done. There's been nothing done. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this bill has been tabled in each parliament since 2006 and has been a part of my party's platform, the New Democratic Party platform, in 2008 and in 2011. But now we have the opportunity again to help migratory workers in this country, Mr. Speaker. The ask is simple. Allow tradespeople and apprentices to deduct travel and accommodation expenses from their taxable income so they can secure and maintain employment at a construction site that is more than 80 kilometers away from their home. It's that simple, Mr. Speaker. This mobile workforce maintains a home and family in communities across Canada, in Atlantic Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador, while using personal funds to maintain employment. Now, included in the tax credit would be the cost of travel, the cost of meals, and the cost of accommodation, less, Mr. Speaker, any money paid by the employer for those purposes. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, this bill makes sense for workers. This bill makes sense for families. This bill makes sense for employers. This bill makes sense for industry. This bill makes sense for taxpayers. This bill, Mr. Speaker, makes sense. Period. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.